you can look around the world and you can see countries like Poland, for example, that are signatories of the ECHR. They managed to kick out migrants, and they have a very, very different level of migration than us. And look at Germany, not just a signatory of the ECHR, but a country that's got much stronger human rights legislation in some areas than we do. And look at what they've just done. They've just expelled Afghans who violated their laws, who committed heinous crimes, and they've expelled them back to Afghanistan.
I'm Ben Houchin. This is the Blueprint Podcast, brought to you by Conservative Home, and we're going to lift the lid on centre-right politics in the UK. We're going to be speaking with influential figures from across the political spectrum to help understand how we can make centre-right politics relevant to people's lives again and turn it back into a political force for good. Well, welcome everybody to another episode of the Blueprint Podcast. Today's guest is Tom Tugendhat, the MP for Tonbridge since 2015. He's a former British Army officer, served in Iraq and Afghanistan, and actually more recently has chaired the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, and most recently, up until the 2024 election, was Minister of Security. Now, leadership contender in the Conservative leadership election. Tom, welcome to the Blueprint Podcast.
Ben, it's good to see you. Thanks for having me on.
Really appreciate you agreeing to come on. I've given a very, very brief overview of your political career. I could have been here for 20 minutes going into the detail of it. I'm sure if people listen to the podcast want, they can go and Google that. But one of the things that often gets missed in these types of conversation is, the person behind the political career. And I think it would be really helpful to the listeners to understand a little bit more about you, Tom, and what your background is that ultimately led you to getting into politics.
Well, look, I mean, not unlike you, actually. I'm sort of new to politics. I mean, that may sound like an odd thing to say after I've been doing it for 8-9 years.
Well, 2015 is not that long ago, is it, really?
But it doesn't feel that long ago, because actually, most of our lives are defined by those really big things that we do, having kids, getting married, starting business in your case. In fact, starting a small business of mine in Beirut in the 90s, starting a small PR unit. And
how did that come about? How do you start a PR business in Beirut?
Well, kind of by accident, actually. So I was a journalist out there, and I started to do some copywriting for an advertising firm, and they started to have PR clients and asked if I'd take it on, and so I did. So I set up this PR unit and started to hire people in Beirut. Can I just say the employment practices of Beirut are genuinely, well, they may have changed now in the last 25 years, but they were genuinely extraordinary. The conditions and the bureaucracy and all the rest of it. But that's what I did, because like you, if you've got an entrepreneurial attitude, whether that's going and starting up as a freelance journalist in Beirut or wanting to make a difference around the world, you have that attitude in many other areas. And for me, it came out in journalism, it came out in business, it came out in soldiering, and it also came out in politics. So, like you, I've done a few things first, and I came to politics late. I came to politics when I was about 40.
So you set up that business, but then you went into the army after that? Or?
Yeah, so I came back to the UK after that, and briefly was a management consultant. It wasn't really my thing.
You don't strike me as the management consultant.
No, I left when one of the partners said, "You're really good at this, but you'll be brilliant when you develop the skills of an accountant." And it was at that moment.
A compliment?
It was at that moment I just went, "Taxi, I'm out." And while I was doing that, I joined the Army Reserve, the Territorial Army, and I did what you do, trained a bit and so on. And then the Iraq War broke out, and because I speak Arabic, I was mobilised to go and serve as an interpreter and intelligence officer alongside various units, and that sort of got me going from, as it were, the Army Reserve to the Army full time. And I then went into government service properly, because I got asked to stay on, and so I stayed on and did various operations in Iraq, and then worked for other bits of government, and ended up going into Afghanistan as well with the same unit. So it was one of those things. It was slightly by accident. I mean, not quite, because of course I'd joined the army first, but you know what I mean. But it wasn't my plan to be a full-time soldier. It was my plan to be to have it as an extra. But 9/11 happened, the world changed, and I spoke Arabic, and I'd studied Islamics, and turned out they were very useful skills.
And so how long did you serve for?
Oh, on and off in uniform for, what was it? It was about 7 or 8 years. but it was sort of 13 years all in, 14 years all in.
Yeah.
But some of that was in the Foreign Office, and some of that was in uniform. So it was about 7-8 years in uniform, and about 2, 3, 4 years in the Foreign Office. Things like
And then what happened thereafter? Because some people make a career of that, can stay in for decades, but you chose a different path.
Yeah, my last job was working. I was the military assistant to the Chief of the Defence Staff, which is a hell of a job. You're working effectively as the principal organizer, SPAD, advisor, whatever term you want to use, whichever world you're in, to the head of the British Armed Forces. So he's in charge of whatever it was at the time, 240,000 personnel, and of course procurement and operations. You're running effectively, or rather helping him to run a business of 40-50 billion pounds a year, operating in 100 countries, under intense scrutiny, intense pressure. So you can imagine it's fascinating, and I had the great good fortune of working for, let's be honest, the most extraordinary leader I've ever had the privilege to serve in, General Richards. It's unusual, when you work with somebody very, very closely, and I either was in the office next to him, or travelling in the seat next to him, or in the hotel room next to him for the best part of 4 years. So you really get to know each other very, very well.
What was it that made somebody like General Richards so special as a leader?
He's remarkably open, and I mean that in a strong way. He's open to ideas, open to input, open to thoughts and challenge. But he also knows what he wants to do. He's very clear-headed, has very strong, determined outlook, which meant that you could have a proper conversation with him about anything. And although, I always called him General Sir or CDS, rank wasn't an obstacle, if you see what I mean. You could have a direct, challenging relationship. And by the way, not just me. I mean, anybody could.
So he didn't close himself off from a hierarchical point of view?
No, not at all. And it was remarkable. I mean, I'd very often, there'd be very often a meeting about a particular subject, whatever it was, and there'd be a dozen people around the table. And I hope you'll forgive me for saying this, but he often wasn't, if you like, the smartest person in the room, by which I mean he didn't have the academic qualifications, or he didn't have the technical qualifications, but he was the only one who everyone would work for. And that was a remarkable ability. He had, I mean, I'm not for a second saying he was stupid. He certainly wasn't.
Yeah.
He was extremely smart, extremely intelligent man. But he wasn't the expert.
Yeah.
And he had the remarkable ability of bringing together people who wouldn't work together otherwise, and being open and challenging and engaging. And he has that sort of personality that allows others to succeed, and by making the mission clear, the purpose clear, and then seeing you succeed in whatever area it was.
Because that's not really what leadership's about, is it? You don't have to be the smartest person in the room in that narrowest sense, as you're absolutely right. And in a very small parochial kind of way, I always say to the people around me that I have very few of the answers. I don't pretend to know all of the answers, but it's about how you build that team to help you deliver the outcomes that you want.
Well, it's one of the things actually you see it a lot in politics. People are nervous and challenged by people who have more experience or different experience or are more intelligent than them. I've never quite understood that. If you want to look good, surround yourself by clever people,
Absolutely.
right? I mean, because the only way, I mean, this, the only thing you're going to be judged on, Ben, is whether or not you transformed Teesside, whether you actually brought jobs to the Redcar Steel plant, or it's going to be pretty binary, right? Nobody's really going to care whether you wrote a clever article or whether or not your autobiography is any good. I mean,
yeah, absolutely.
That's not what people are going to.
Wouldn't it be terrible, by the way?
Well, I suspect it'd be quite funny, but I won't say why I think that now on this. The only thing people are going to judge you on is whether or not you brought jobs and opportunity to that community. And if you want it to be all about you, fine, but you're not going to succeed. And what you've achieved is because you've made sure it's not about you. It's about the community you're serving. It's about the leadership you're offering and the actions you're taking. And I think, for me, that was the lesson from General Richards, but it was also the lesson from various other commanders I worked with along the way who, taught me what leadership's about. And, when I look at the country today, I'm afraid, it's clear that that's what we're missing. We're missing that leadership that sets a mission, that sets a goal, that highlights what this country can truly be, and as part of that says, look, I'm going to get the best people I can around the table. Look, I'm not interested in the deals. I'm not interested in doing deals before an election, or deals before a leadership challenge, or deals before, no. It's not about that. It's about who can I get around the table? Who is the best person for, reindustrializing parts of the country? I mean, you've demonstrated that you're brilliant at it. Who's the best person at understanding the agricultural industry and the challenge we face for food security? Who's the best person to make sure that we keep this great country together and we take on the challenge of divisive nationalism and separatism across the UK? Each of these subjects has a different answer and a different question.
Yep.
And the key to leadership has got to be to get the right people around the table, because when I look at politics over the last 7, 8, 9 years, or 9 years that I've been in Parliament, too much of it has been, so and so, voted for me in the third round of the last leadership election, or Harry has, if I don't have Harry there, then he'll get really angry and he'll throw his teddies out the pram. I mean, come on, grow up. This is about the government of the United Kingdom, the greatest country the world has ever known, and about the opportunity for 65, 70 million people as we develop our lives, our hopes and our dreams over the next, decades. As far as I'm concerned, it should be entirely focused on serving the British people completely, absolutely and totally, and not on self-service ego trips or jobs for the boys.
Well, it's to play devil's advocate though a little bit, Tom, and you've been in Westminster. I haven't been in Westminster because I'm not really of it, but it strikes me that is also part of politics, right? You can't ignore the fact that sometimes it's about egos, sometimes it's about individuals wanting to make a name for themselves. How do you do that as a Tom Tugendhat Conservative Party, and recognise that that's all part of the system that you've got to operate in?
Well, you're right. It is about more than delivery, and I think that's what's deeply frustrating. And I think it's probably one of the things that's kept you thinking that Teesside is rather a decent place to be. And I think it may be. I'm putting words in his mouth now, but it may be something that's kept Andy Street from running for a seat at the last election, because he's as he says himself, he's an executive leader.
Yeah.
And as are you, and it's a different form of, it's a very different form of politics.
It is.
But I think that's where, frankly, we in Westminster need to clean up our act. I mean, you don't need me to tell you what the last 5 years have looked like at various points. You've had a ringside seat, both understanding politics, but also a distant seat because you've been serving a community a few hundred miles away, and seeing that difference, that perspective, has been, I'm sure, pretty revealing. But even from inside, frankly, it's been intensely frustrating watching a psychodrama of egos battling it out over the narcissism of small differences.
But how do you deal with that? So if you win the leadership election, you're going to bring the right people around the table. You're going to, like I say, you're going to be the person that's able to get the best out of people. But there is still a wider parliamentary party which, unfortunately, even though we would like the world to be a different place, we have to deal with it as it is. Certain individuals will always be, it's one of the, you've touched upon it, the last 5 years, there's been that infighting, there's been the briefing, there's been all of that. How do you stop that from happening?
Well, I think, funnily enough, I come back to the lessons General Richards taught me. It's two of those. One is you set a clear mission. Now, I think the mission of a Conservative government should be, pretty simply, the prosperity and happiness of the British people. That's it. And we must do absolutely everything we can to achieve that. That's why, we can obsess about, a particular issue if you like, but the reality is life is complicated and we've got to bring issues together. So if you look at, for example, healthcare reform or social care reform, the two are fundamentally connected. If you want to talk about social care, you need to be talking about migration. You can't just talk about migration in isolation. You need to talk about it in how you're going to transform the economy. If you're going to transform the economy, you need to talk about savings and the way in which the connection between generations is built up. If you want to talk about that, you need to talk about housing and the way in which this country, I'm afraid, over the last 20 years has sort of worshipped bricks and forgotten that actually it's brains that create opportunity, innovation and growth. And so you've got to look at these things in a connected way, and that's where I think the leadership that we've got to offer across the United Kingdom and to the parliamentary party is actually pretty similar, which is to set out that very clear goal as to what we're trying to achieve as Conservatives and based on Conservative values, that you achieve the prosperity and happiness of the British people, when you remove regulation, when you enable people to take more decisions of their own, and when the state, you don't need me to tell you this, you've literally demonstrated it, when the state is your partner, not your ruler. And what you've achieved in Teesside is phenomenal in that. You've demonstrated that the state is an important partner to growth, a partner to opportunity, and can take on risks that an individual business, which has got inherently much shorter time horizons, simply can't take on. The thing about the state, the remarkable thing about the state, is it's the ability. I mean, if you boil it down to its essence, what is the state? The state is the long-term hopes and aspirations of the British people. That's all it is. It's nothing more than that. It's not an entity of its own. It's not some sort of magic creation. All it is the collective long-term desires of the British people. That's it. And if we get it to work properly, as you have, ensuring that long-term objective is actually set out, defended, and invested in, then others can come in underneath and fill in their part of the bargain. Whether that's a long-term investment, what is it, £1 billion you got off South Korean firm? You know what I mean?
It's this point of the government and the state. There is a social infrastructure. I mean, I always kind of say, well, if you want to set up a factory, if it's in the middle of the Sahara Desert and it's got no utilities, no roads, if it's got no education, so you don't have a workforce. I mean, there is a role for the state to provide in that, to be able to enable the private sector to thrive. And I think you touched upon it earlier. I think there's an interesting point that politicians, particularly those in Westminster, miss, is they'd rather write the article in the Telegraph or another newspaper saying how important they are, rather than realising that the public don't really care about the means by and large. They care about the outcomes. And we can sometimes get a little bit too hung up on the purism of kind of a free market or the protectionism of a socialist state. And in reality, as I think you and I both agree, Tom, the world isn't black and white. It's lived in the grey, and we have to understand that the state plays an important role in that.
Well, look, I think that's absolutely right. And when we talk about the effects of social media, I mean, and don't get me wrong, I mean, some of it can be pretty nasty and pretty unpleasant. You don't need me to tell you that. You've had your own.
Yeah, we all have.
We all
politics
have. I mean,
isn't
that's
it?
true. That's true. But actually, I would argue that the biggest problem of social media is funny enough, not that. It's the way in which it has allowed many politicians to believe that life can be oversimplified. And that actually the job of a politician is to oppose, even politicians in government. I mean, actually, if you look at what Keir Starmer is doing at the moment, he's effectively in government, acting like an opposition. He's opposing so many of the institutions that actually are going to make this country great. So he's opposing the education industry. He's opposing, he's opposing pensioners. He's opposing, he's setting out a politics of opposition, rather than a politics of construction. He's not building off the legacy of, I was about to say, of our education reforms, but let's be honest, they're also Blair's education reforms, and before that they're Thatcher's education reforms. No, instead he's trying to reverse them. This politics of opposition that has been embedded into the way in which social media tends to work is, I think, a negative, and for exactly the reasons that you say, because if you want to pick holes in things, look, I can always pick holes in things. That's not what's difficult.
Yeah.
What's difficult is building things.
Absolutely.
And
it's a point of leadership as well. I mean, I always take the view. Somebody once told me that a good leader has hubris, humour, and humility, and it's a really interesting point, because as a leader, you've got to instill that level of hope. And if you look at the great elections in the West over the last 15 years, whether it was the hope of the Obama campaign in the US, even the Boris campaign of levelling up and hope for a brighter future. There are other examples. Thatcher, you could argue, in the 80s.
Morning in America, as Reagan famously did.
Absolutely, and I think, irrespective of the state of a country, and there are lots of political arguments going on at the minute about the state of the country, either for good or for ill, the leadership has to be able to set out a better tomorrow. Otherwise, the system and the people can't rally behind it, because, again, what's that mission? The mission can't be to oppose. The mission has to be for a better tomorrow.
Well, and that's what I'm afraid. I feel that we, albeit and now Keir Starmer particularly, seem to have decided that our job is to manage decline. Now, I don't buy that. I'm sorry, I really don't buy that your job in Teesside was to slowly make more and more people unemployed until eventually global forces made the Redcar Steelworks unaffordable. It was already unaffordable. Your job was to tear off the plaster and make sure jobs came back faster in new technologies. Now that's what you're doing. Whether it's that net zero turbine that you're looking to build. If I'm sure you will build it. I'm sure you will build it. And when you do, it'll be it'll be a technological development the like of which we haven't seen around the world, and once it works and works well, it will be exported, and Teesside will be again what it has been for 100 and something years, which is the workshop of the world, developing technologies and then exporting them globally. And that dealership in hope, if you like, that sort of belief in a better future, I think is so essential. When you hear Keir Starmer talk, I mean, all you hear is sort of fear, anguish, depression, and that's only when he's talking about Angela Rayner, let alone when he's talking about the economy.
I think, just moving on a bit, Tom, so, and I hope you don't mind me phrasing it in this way, but I was reading Conservative Home, who are the partners of the Blueprint podcast, and there was an article there the other day that was titled, the headline was, "Is Tom Tugendhat a lefty?" Now, I'll profess, I didn't read the article, I just saw the headline and it just caught in my mind, and I thought, well, that's an interesting one. I mean, again, we were speaking just before we were recording it. We know each other a little bit, not particularly well. We've certainly got to know each other over the last few weeks. And I personally kind of feel like you get a bit of a harsh rap in some circles of being seen as a bit of a lefty. You don't strike me as a lefty. Your kind of political cause, your policies, the grounding in politics and your background doesn't strike me as being a lefty. You seem like a pretty sensible centre-right politician. Where does that kind of thing come from, do you think? And what do you think has been the cause of that slight thread that seems to have developed, certainly during the leadership contest, but even before so?
I mean, look, I find it really interesting because, when the question was coming as to how do we pay for social care, and there was a question about raising national insurance in order to pay for it, I didn't support that. Now I'm one of the, I think I'm the only one among the candidates who didn't. That's perfectly fine. The others were in government. I understand why they took collective responsibility on that. I respect their position, but I didn't support it because I thought it was wrong to charge people 2.5% of their income to pay for a £60,000 insurance premium. You can get better rates from that off Compare the Market or one of those comparison sites. Does that make me left or right wing? I don't know. When I voted against the vaccine passports, I understand why others did. They had collective responsibility. It's a perfectly respectable position, but I kept asking the then scientists, one of whom is now a Labour minister, but whether or not there was any evidence for it. There wasn't. So, does standing up for the liberty of the British people at a time when so many liberties were being taken away, does that make me a lefty or a righty? I find it one of those really interesting questions, because the truth is, left wing and right wing are sort of socialist terms that are used to divide people, right? And one of the things I think we should always be careful of is using our enemy. Well, they're not our enemies, but you know what I mean. Using our rivals' terms, using our opposition's terms, because effectively it shapes us into blocks. And the truth is, as you know, conservatism is fundamentally about what makes Britain work. Yeah, that's what it's about.
It's a very pragmatic approach to government.
Right. We're not ideologues like the socialists, where we've got this sort of eternal vision of the future, perfect Britain, where everyone is equal, everyone is wearing a little blue cap and little blue, Mao jackets and all the rest of it. No, that's not what we're about. We're about whatever works to make you, your family, safer, happier, more prosperous.
Absolutely.
That's what we're about. And so when we sort of start to get into these ideological games as to whether or not you're more or less this or that or whatever, it gets really complicated because it doesn't really work in the conservative tradition.
But it also doesn't fit into a neat box, does it? That's the problem. No. There aren't just a set of policies that... I mean, I was listening to somebody online the other day and they were horrified because this was a socialist. They were horrified that it was now seen as right-wing to defend free speech in the UK. I kind of listened to that and thought, well, hang on, it's always been about individual freedoms. Free speech is a part of an individual freedom. Yeah. That is a right of centre and always has been a right of... So it's really interesting, depending on the prism you look at it through. Again, from a Teesside point of view, I think people have always found it difficult to kind of pigeonhole me because we nationalised an airport on one policy, and at the other end we were responsible for the most free market thing that the 14 years of a Conservative government did with free ports, right? So it's about the pragmatism, as you say.
This is where, forgive me, this is where your conservatism, I think, is, it's straight down the line, straight in the traditions of Margaret Thatcher and Macmillan and Churchill and Baldwin and Disraeli.
That sounds a bit grandiose to me, Tom.
Well, I mean, the reason I say that is because you're...
I know you're being very generous of coming on the podcast.
Well, let me tell you why I think that. It's because actually... you have a fundamental understanding of what it is to belong to an area, what it is to be of an area, right? So you never make the argument, look, mate, you've lost your job, get on the train and go to London or go to Manchester or go to wherever, right? You say, no, this is your home, and my job as your mayor is to improve it, right? It's to bring in investment. And you don't then say, and that's why, it's all about slashing taxes to zero and, the devil take the hindmost, but, it's a free fall. No, you say the state is not in charge of you, but the state can partner with you. The state can take those long-term risks that you couldn't otherwise take, but actually the state's job is not to build you the job, but to allow you to have the opportunity
to facilitate.
Exactly right. And I think that's fundamentally conservative. It's building on the tradition of an area. It's building on the understanding of what it is to be, a northeasterner in this sense, a Teessider, because what you've done, you've fundamentally understood that actually Teesside is an entrepreneurial area. I'm just look at Teesside's history, right? I mean, it's industrial entrepreneurship for 100 years or more. And before that, it's maritime and so on. I mean,
do you think the issue with some of the prisms that people see you through is a prism of Brexit? I mean, we were just talking about there. I mean, I've done lots of things that you could argue are left of centre or right of centre, but I was a strong Brexiteer, still believe in Brexit. So you could argue that certain people have kind of turned a blind eye to the fact that we nationalised an airport locally. Whereas maybe they see you through a different prism because you didn't vote for Brexit.
Look, I think that's probably right. And and I know there's many people who supported Brexit who, like Jeremy Corbyn, who actually saw Brexit as the first step in the socialist revolution and therefore some sort of very left-wing agenda. And there's other people like me who saw it as an opportunity to have a massive single market across 400 million people. Now,
there's definitely a protectionist thread in a certain part of the Brexit voting public that I don't think Westminster and kind of the mainstream media really understood. I think it was caricatured as, your right-wing free marketeers,
and
libertarian types.
That's the point that
and
Dan
it was
Hannan
much more
made.
Complicated than that.
Yeah, and look, Dan Hannan made some very, very persuasive arguments in that direction, and I share many of his views on that actually. But you can share views and yet have tactical differences if you see
Absolutely.
what I mean.
Absolutely.
And I think Brexit became one of those binary issues, whether you are either in favour or against, and everything followed from there. And of course, that's just not true. Many people have different, many people came down 52-48 on one side or the other, not just the British people, but many people in their own hearts came down like that.
Well, you were telling me earlier, you had a free market approach as to why you voted Remain.
Yeah, exactly. For me, it was all about making sure that we had as large and open a trading bloc as possible so that we could take on the free market, the free market interests around the world. Now, we've made up for it a bit with CPTPP. We've made up for a bit with, our deals with Australia and New Zealand. But let's be honest, talk to farmers about those deals and ask them what they think. And, this is going to require a period of readjustment. But then again, there's, from my own perspective, there are some very strong advantages. One of the things I'm a huge believer in is how technology is going to transform our world and the way we improve productivity. And you look at the way the European Union's gone down data protection routes, that's going to hold back artificial intelligence. It's going to hold back the opportunity to grow a tech industry in the future. So,
well, the EU's always been inclined towards protectionism as a bloc, hasn't it?
It's a protectionist unit within itself, and then it has, and this is where I sympathise with the Brexiteers, and this is where people like people like Steve Baker and others have, they're friends because I share.
It's almost like there's a nuanced position to Brexit.
It's almost like there is, Ben. But this is where I share their views, because the truth is, the European Union comes at this with a very different perspective. Of course they come up with a different perspective. Look at the history of Europe over the last 100 years and compare it to the history of the United Kingdom. And of course there are overlaps, but there are also major divergences. We weren't occupied. We haven't had a dictatorial state. We haven't had that loss of trust that you have when your government is overthrown by force and a foreign army is marching through your streets. We haven't had those breaks. We've had a permanent, slow evolutionary tradition of rights and responsibilities over whatever it is now, sort of 200-300 years. Now that's very different from our European partners. That doesn't mean they're any more or less close friends or whatever, and it doesn't mean that we don't have enormously close security relationships with them, as we do with in intelligence and security we have with many countries, but very few closer than some of our European partners. And when you look at our defence relationship with France, I mean, it's one of the things that we always talk about, the Five Eyes relationship, and we talk about the Commonwealth, and those are incredibly important. But I don't know if you know, Ben, but every British division has got a French deputy commander, and every French division has got a British deputy commander.
I didn't know that. No.
The skies over the United Kingdom protected against Russian incursion. Sorry, that was a
slip
joke.
of the tongue.
That was a joke. Look, the skies over Britain are protected by Royal Air Force interceptor aircraft, as you know well. One of the pilots is normally French, and the same is true in reverse. And the Combined Joint Expeditionary Force, which is made up of French and British troops, the level of cooperation is, I think, beyond what I think many people fully understand. And the reality is, what we're arguing how best to govern a relationship between very close friends. This isn't a relationship of hostility; it's a relationship of partnership. And I think it is absolutely reasonable for people to have looked at the last deal and thought, it doesn't work well enough for us. I think that's a perfectly reasonable position to have taken. It's also a reasonable position to say, well, the downsides are bigger than the upsides.
Yeah. It seems to me as well that the leadership contest has kind of evolved from the Brexit question into the ECHR question, obviously with what we've seen with small boats and immigration. And again, you've got quite a clear line on your approach to the ECHR.
Yeah, I mean, look, it has become a bit that I wouldn't like to simplify it to that, because let's be honest, the question about the leadership of the Conservative Party can't come down to a single issue. It can't just be about immigration. If it is, we're not talking to the British people. Now that doesn't mean that immigration isn't important. Of course it's important. But for most people, immigration is actually not about, the British people are not anti-foreigner in any way. You see that by the way that people welcomed
Absolutely.
Ukrainians, Hong Kongers and those Afghans who served alongside us into our communities. They're not anti-foreigner. They just want to make sure that the goods and services they receive, whether that's spaces in schools and hospitals, or whether it's houses and roads, are built in such a way that we make sure we maintain our integrity as a state and our ability to provide services. And of course, people mind about rapid changes in culture as well. But that's what people mind about. And my own view is that we need to slow down migration. I've made a pledge to 100,000 because the truth is we need to have an absolute fixed mission that brings public services and business together. Because I'm afraid, you can stand on the White Cliffs and shout at foreigners as much as you like. The truth is, unless you change the drivers for migration, that sort of need for low-skilled, low-wage employment in this country, you simply won't get numbers down. That's why, what I talk about is not migration alone, but the changes we need to the economy, the level of investment that you need to transform businesses, the improvements in productivity, the changes in social care and in healthcare to make sure that you don't, refuse to accept foreigners and then see old people dying alone in their homes. That's a big change. Yeah. And on the ECHR, I mean, it's do you
think we should leave the ECHR?
Well, look, I first started writing about this, funnily enough, in 2013 because. Then I saw it in the battlefield. So I'd been on operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I saw the way in which European law had interfered in the way that we'd conducted ourselves. But let's be clear, it's not European law as in written by Europeans. It's European law as in it's written by Brits and imposed on Europeans. So it's an interpretation of British law, really. And what other countries did, France, Germany and others, is they opted out of certain elements of the ECHR, which they're perfectly entitled to do. The treaty allows you to do that. And the then Labour government hadn't done that. What they'd done is then maintain the same human rights tradition, as it were, abroad as applies at home. Now, I don't think that's appropriate. And that's why I've been clear that what we should be doing is making sure we opt out of those bits where we can, and I mentioned one there. There are other areas in terms of rights to family reunification and so on, where we can say, if you violate our laws, if you make this country unsafe for others, then you can forfeit, or we can refuse to apply certain elements of the treaty.
So you think we could leave? You think we can stay in the ECHR and in effect get the derogations and the exemptions we require?
Well, the first thing we've got to do is use the derogations. Then we've got to make sure we get the reforms when we need them, because the truth is the reform of the ECHR is important. It's become more interpretive.
Do you think that's doable?
Yes.
That kind of strikes me as going back to kind of the Brexit question of like, will reform, it'll change rather than leave.
I mean, look, I'm a conservative because I believe in building on tradition and making sure we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, right?
Yep.
But I think you've got to be prepared to make the changes if you need to. And that's why I'm saying I am prepared to leave. And I'm prepared to leave because if the derogations don't make enough of a difference and if the reforms aren't possible, then you need to be prepared to leave. Now, prepared is an important word there. You need to actually do your homework in advance. Because the truth is, it will affect things like the Good Friday Agreement. It will affect things like the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. It'll have other implications on other international treaties and other trade deals. And we need to make sure that when we leave, if we need to leave, we have done it in a way that is actually organised, and we don't just sort of, decide that it's all over and we're off.
Yeah.
And that's where I think we need to get to. We need to make sure we're organised because, you can look around the world and you can see countries like Poland, for example, that are signatories of the ECHR. They managed to kick out migrants and they have a very, very different level of migration than us. And look at Germany, not just a signatory of the ECHR, but a country that's got much stronger human rights legislation in some areas than we do. And look at what they've just done. They've just expelled Afghans who violated their laws, who committed heinous crimes, and they've expelled them back to Afghanistan. Now,
how did they do? I mean, I saw that. How did they do that? Because again, the UK argument is, one of the largest countries of origin for illegal immigration into the country at the minute is Afghanistan. But the default, certainly when you hear it in the media and people talking about it, is you're not going to be able to deport them back to Afghanistan because of the Taliban rule and the threat that they would have to their safety.
So what the Germans did is they expelled them to Qatar, and Qatar then sent them back to Afghanistan. But the Germans made the...
But in the UK, that would have...
I know, you're right.
The UK lawyer would have said, well, this is all a fix, right? It's a ruse. They're going to Qatar, but they're actually going back to Afghanistan.
But what the German government did is I think they made a very reasonable decision. And I think the reasonable decision they made is to say that human rights are made to protect all of us. And if your actions violate the human rights of others, then your rights come second. You simply cannot be applying individual human rights against somebody who is literally going out of their way to destroy the human rights of others. And if you are, as was the case in some of these different individuals, if you're going to commit rape or if you're going to commit serious assault, then I'm afraid your rights come second to the victims. The victims' rights come first.
And I think that's where people in the street get frustrated because, again, they're living their lives, they're not that interested in politics, never mind the details of the ECHR protocol, but they do see that, and they see that there is an inherent unfairness that, these people are having their human rights prioritised over the victims in the UK, right, where you've used those examples of kind of rape and murder, etc.
But that's exactly right, and that's why I'm saying this is about changing the way we act in the United Kingdom, and it may require leaving the ECHR, but actually a lot of the obstacles that we're seeing here are happening in our own courts. They're not even getting to the ECHR. They're not even getting to the Strasbourg courts. They're being blocked a long time before then. So what do we have to do to change the culture in the legal process in the United Kingdom? Is it a question of just changing the law? Do we actually have to leave the treaty? What is it that we need to do? Now, that's what I want to work on because actually, let's be honest, I don't think most people care whether we're in or out of the ECHR. What they care about is, can we keep our borders safe?
Absolutely. Can
we keep our people safe? That's what my mission is. So when I say, my mission is the prosperity and happiness of the British people, let me be quite clear. That means, are people safe in their own homes, in their own communities, in their own towns? If you're not, I failed in my mission. So what I need to be doing is to be making sure that everything we do delivers on that. Now, it may be possible, in fact, it may be even likely in some areas, that leaving the ECHR contributes to that. It's possible, it may be even likely in other areas, that it makes no difference.
Yeah.
So we need to make sure what we're doing is we are defending the interests of the British people in every sense, in every way. And that's exactly what I'd do as leader.
Well, it comes back to, I think, your theme, which is, outcome focused and delivering for people rather than getting wrapped up in the nuances of the hows and the whys. I mean, that's for politicians to think about, but delivering outcomes for people. I mean, I also absolutely agree, by the way, that the Conservative Party in and of itself will have failed if it turns the leadership contest into one about immigration as a sole cause, because you're right, it's absolutely important to people. But again, if we park immigration, we've talked about that quite a lot. If you are elected as leader and we're standing on the door with somebody and we ask that person in a year or two's time, what does Tom Tugendhat Conservative Party stand for? What does it mean to you? What would you want them to say back to you?
Well, I want them to be absolutely certain that what the Conservative Party stands for is them. And that means their family, their community, and their future. Because the truth is, if we don't get that right, the rest of it doesn't matter. Most people aren't, as you rightly know, but most people aren't interested in grand ideas of high ideology or different, political. They're interested in whether or not their kids have got a good school, whether or not their parents are being looked after in their old age, and whether they've got a job. Now, those are the challenges we need to address. And that's why the areas that I'm looking at changing are making sure that the economy works for everyone. Look, we haven't had a proper conservative revolution in this country since the late 70s, early 80s, right? We haven't seen a transformation the like of which we need to see. So we've seen that creep back of the state over the last...
So what does that look like in practice? From you as leader, Tom, what does that look like in practice to have that revolution that we need?
So it looks like some pretty big economic changes. Look at the investments that you've got into Teesside, right? You've got some phenomenal investments. You've got a South Korean company that is building wind turbines. You've got that company that's building the net zero turbine with the carbon capture and storage facility offshore. A lot of that money is foreign. Now, that's great. Absolutely. And I'm absolutely delighted that you're attracting foreign direct investment. But the truth is, if we're only attracting foreign investment and we're not generating investment of our own, then what we're doing is effectively we are putting ourselves effectively dependent on the kindness of strangers. That's what we're doing. And we need to make sure that we get our own capital markets flowing again. And I talk about live money and dead money. And the reason I talk about live money and dead money is because the truth is, cash, capital, if you like, is the blood that runs through the body. It's what connects generations and geographies. Because cash is nothing more than just the ability to transfer energy and ideas from one area to another. So when I invest in Teesside, all I'm doing is I'm taking the energy and investment from a community like mine in Tunbridge, and I'm putting it into Teesside, hoping that you're going to then make that work, and then that money will flow again, and it'll either flow back to Tunbridge or it might flow to somewhere else, right? What we've seen over the last 30 years, for various different reasons, and I'm not blaming any particular government, is we've seen that live money, if you like, that money that's flowing through the system, turned into dead money. What's effectively happened, it's been frozen. And you can see it. You can absolutely see it. So you can see it in the symptoms, right? You can see it in the symptoms that DeepMind could not raise the hundreds of millions of pounds it needed to get to the next stage here in the UK. So they had to be sold to Google.
Why was that?
Well, because they couldn't raise the cash. Now, let me tell you the fundamental of it. The same is true, by the way, of ARM, which was sold to SoftBank, right? Yeah. Those are symptoms. What's the cause? Well, the cause is that very slowly we have regulated more and more and more to take risk out of investment. A perfectly understandable reason. You saw what happened with Equitable Life. You saw what happened with Mirror Group newspapers. You saw what happened with the pensions industry across the UK in the 90s. Increasing amounts of risk. People didn't feel that their savings were safe. So the government started to regulate. And part of that regulation was to remove that early stage risk, that risk over the next 5 to 7 years that people can actually control. And what they did by doing that is effectively they injected massive amounts of long-term risk. Because what they did was they removed the ability of people to invest more into equities, the sort of, the money that starts a business or hires somebody or sees an idea develop. And they had to put it into debt in order for it to be safer. And actually what that's done is effectively it's taken money out of the live economy, the live money, and it's put it into the dead economy, the bricks and the government debt. And that is a net harm to society. Now, just look at the comparisons. If you are a pension fund in Australia, about 20% of your money, that's about 18 actually, but about 20% of your money is in debt, about 80% is in equities and hiring people. The same is true in Canada, similar in America. What is it in the UK? 60% in debt. 3 times as much of your money has effectively been frozen and isn't free to hire people. So what does that mean? Well, it means that you don't have the cash. You don't have the cash to start the business. You don't have or more importantly, actually, you don't have the cash to take your business from that early stage of being you and a couple of other people in a garage to actually becoming a business that's growing, that's developing, that's hiring more people and innovating. And that's a real problem. That's a fundamental problem with the economy.
It is. It's something, interestingly, that's been coming up time and time again more recently about this kind of broken view of modern capitalism, particularly within the UK.
It's not broken. It's overregulated. It's broken because we've frozen it, and that's the mistake we've made. We've made the mistake that governments often make. They try to eliminate risk. But you can't eliminate risk. Right. There's no way of eliminating risk.
Well, it's built into the model of capitalist market, right?
Well, it's just built into life, I'm afraid. I mean, it's just true, right? I mean, and let's be honest. Risk is like energy; it can be neither created nor destroyed. All you can do is transfer it.
Absolutely.
And the truth is, what we've done is because governments like to control the things they can control, we have regulated out risk over the term of a government that it can foresee, 5 to 7 years. And of course, all that means is, you've lowered the short-term risk, but you've massively increased the long-term risk. Look at pensioners. Pensioners are getting a return, because it's largely based on debt, of, in the low single digits, 2 to 5% returns over their pensions, not the 12% returns that you'd get if you were in Canada or Australia or America. Now, that's costing the pensioner. That is a huge cost on the pensioner. What's the compound interest of 5% a year? I mean, it's a huge amount of money that's being taken away from pensioners.
These changes that you're talking about bringing in, and you would look to bring in to deregulate, in effect, some of these markets. We might have some people listening to the Blueprint podcast that have stumbled this way and are not necessarily of this type of conversation. How does that help Mr. or Mrs. Smith in Teesside or Humberside or Liverpool? And how do those changes affect them? Who they're not going to directly start up their own business, maybe some of their children or grandchildren might.
But look, let's look at it. So I started off by talking about the symptoms, right? The symptoms are that Google has bought DeepMind or that SoftBank has bought Arm. What are the consequences of that? Well, the consequences are that when you see the next level of development, where does it go? Well, it doesn't go to the UK, does it? It goes
back to headquarters.
It goes back to headquarters, exactly right. And the same is true when you see decisions being made on things like water or investments in rail or energy. You find yourself having to go abroad for that money because you don't have the cash in the UK. So instead of being able to borrow off British pensioners, borrow in the equity sense, as it were,
absolutely.
Have that stake in the investment in the building the future. Instead of having that shared belief over 100 years, what you do is you go to foreigners, and really good foreigners like Australians. I mean, nothing wrong with Australian money, nothing wrong with Canadian money, but they automatically have to have a shorter term time horizon. Of course they do, because they're working for different people, right? They're not working for your pensioners, they're working for pensioners in Australia. So they've got to think about currency risk, they've got to think about geographical and geopolitical risk, they've got to think about changes in the regulatory environment in their own country, which won't be linked to the questions about the long-term investment in that infrastructure, but simply based on their own domestic considerations. So what that does is it massively reduces the time horizon. It means that instead of being invested for 100 years, like we did with the Victorians, right? When we built train lines, they knew they were investing for 100 years. People are investing for at most 10, maybe 20 years. And that really changes things. It means that, our water companies have to focus on paying out dividends rather than investing in the long term. It means that our water companies, our train lines don't have the long-term investment that makes a difference. And they have to pay more effectively for capital than they would otherwise. And it means that we find ourselves in a world where we are not investing enough in the infrastructure that our country needs to develop.
I think you've hit on something. I think one of the things you can see the politics of this, right? People will try and characterise this as, taking more risk with people's pensions and, casino banking is back and all that kind of stuff. Whereas actually, I think as the UK, we've become slightly too navel-gazing and parochial in the way that we look at these things. I think the Australians, the super-ands in Canada are great examples. They're incredible, right? They're investing all over the world. They're making loads of money.
Yeah.
And actually,
they're effectively sovereign wealth funds.
Absolutely. And they're creating huge returns for their pensioners. Yeah. And if we could, I think you're absolutely right. I think you've hit on something here, Tom, that we need to move that narrative and the dial to have these more global conversations about other models in the world that work. Because the one, like I say, I think there is an increasing narrative locally that the model that we currently have isn't working. So this is the Conservative way of being able to bring back that wealth.
But this is exactly right. And this is Conservative because, frankly, it's building on some very, very fundamental truths. When people are saving for their pension, do they really think that they're burying it in the ground to dig up in 30 years' time? No, they don't. They think that they're using that money to help people start businesses, to see employment, to see growth because they want their kids and their grandchildren to have the chance, exactly as...
And ultimately that their investment itself will grow.
Exactly right. And, because the truth is, whether you're invested in the state, if your pension is in the state, or whether it's in the private sector, it doesn't matter. Yeah. The reality is you are fundamentally invested in the ability of young people coming after you to grow the economy, to either pay the taxes or to buy the goods that you're invested in. That's what you're invested in. And so if you don't get that growth, what you end up doing is you end up in the position where we are now, where effectively the state is growing at about 2% because low-skilled migration has boosted national GDP, but at the same time wage GDP, the individual opportunity for individuals to grow their own personal economy, has basically flatlined. Now that is a series of decisions we've taken based on constraint, based on avoidance of risk, based on effectively a bureaucratisation of the British industry that I think is net harmful. Now, as I say, when I look at what you've done, this isn't a question of, private good and state bad. This is a question of partnership. And at the moment, we've got that partnership out of whack.
Well, what you said, interestingly, I was just listening to you there in a more nuanced, and obviously we're in a slightly longer form interview here compared to others, but if you were to rephrase what you just said, it's not a million miles away from what Nigel Farage is talking about, really, when you're talking about, boosting skills locally, issues around low-skilled migration, trying to rebuild the British manufacturing sectors, financial sectors, all of those things.
But look,
which runs counter to the bit we were talking about earlier, that it seems like a relatively sensible, centre-right approach to have, right?
So look, Nigel Farage has always been very, very good at identifying problems. He's never demonstrated any inclination to actually fix them, but he's always been very, very good at identifying problems. And I would
say he takes a more protectionist slant than you would.
Yeah, mine is more
absolutely.
Sort of, I wouldn't overstate it, but mine is more free market than his.
Yeah.
But I think fundamentally, this is something that we need to be aware of. I mean, one of the reasons why Nigel and I have agreed on deep caution about China over recent years is we've seen things like the steelworks question that we've seen in the UK, where we've seen effectively massive state subsidies in one country distorting the ability of other countries to compete. And that's where I think there is a question of whether or not you put in protection. Do you look at the way in which China is looking to export massive amounts of EVs, all of them subsidized to a varying degree, in a way that would allow them to destroy the UK car industry? Or do you actually think about putting tariffs on as the Americans, and it looks like the European Union will?
This is a Treasury issue, and I've had this for years. I find the Treasury groupthink is astonishing on this, because you'll know the default is, the market will direct capital to where it thinks it needs to go, and in principle that works just fine.
Yeah.
But actually, when you raise that up to a global level, that has to make the assumption that everybody's playing by the same rules.
Yeah, right. But this is true, Ben, and this is exactly so. I mean, I get into
and they're obviously not.
And they're obviously not, right? I mean, this is where I get into an argument with people about ESG, environmental security and governance, social and governance rules for various goods. When you're talking about EVs, do I want to see a decarbonised future? Of course I do. I mean, of course I want to see net zero. Of course I want to end, the challenge of climate change that we're seeing in various different ways, as do you, But there are ways of doing this. One of the ways of doing it is your net zero turbine and carbon capture and storage, the like of which we see off the north east coast near Aberdeen. We see it off your coast and Teesside. We're seeing these sort of phenomenal changes. Do we really want to see it by closing down British industry based on massive subsidised by the Chinese state, including not just actual subsidies, but the ability to use prison labour, what some people sometimes call slave labour, in places like Xinjiang, to make batteries that have been mined by, made out of materials mined by children in Congo? I mean, please tell me why you think it's greener to use slave-made, child-mined goods than it is to use unionised workforces in the West. I don't buy it. Right?
There's also this really strange kind of thought experiment here, in that you can import these types of materials and products from China, slave labour, prison labour, next to no wages, working conditions, subsidies by the state to distort the market. If a company instead of being based in China, was based in the UK doing those things, they wouldn't even
be closed down in a heartbeat.
Well, they wouldn't have been able to start
Right,
up. Never
exactly.
mind.
I mean,
But we kind of turn a blind eye because we do seem in this country to have this parochial, inward-looking view of the world, and we also then project that out to the rest of the world that everybody's playing by the rules that we're playing by.
Well, and they're not. And this is why, let me be quite clear. I'm not anti-China. I'm a huge fan of Chinese culture and history. What I am against is the Chinese Communist Party seeking to distort global trade, to undermine the connections between people, to make us all poorer in the long term by making us more dependent on goods and services that are provided based on subsidies that, frankly, are fictional. I mean, do you genuinely believe that the Chinese communist system is so great that it is going to actually subsidize the goods and services for the globe over the next century? I mean, I don't. I mean, I think what they're doing is they're trying to do what many businesses do, and they're trying to achieve a loss leader position so that they effectively create a monopoly of dependency.
Yeah.
Now, I mean...
we've seen that with steel, we've seen it in the car market,
exactly
we're now
right.
seeing it in those critical minerals, we've seen it in solar panels.
Right.
Nobody in the world is looking to produce those in any significant way now.
Well, you can't.
Because they've cornered the market in the way that they have.
Exactly right. I mean, if you want to make solar panels now, you are frankly competing against people who can make it at a tenth of the price, or maybe even a hundredth of the price, because of the way in which technology was both stolen and then adapted.
But also those inbuilt kind of subsidies and biases and cheap labour that the rest of, certainly in the Western world, we don't have. So it's impossible. There is no even playing field.
Exactly. And that's where I think we need to be clear that conservatism is about. It's not about sort of free market libertarianism, but nor is it about closed isolationism.
Absolutely.
It's about making sure what you're doing understands, and this is, I come back to your politics and what you've achieved in Teesside, understands that people belong to a community and that the community belongs to them. So if you're a Teessider, or if you're a Kentish man, that's who you are, that's where you're from, and you shouldn't be told to move every 2 years just to chase the latest job. We do have a responsibility as politicians to seek to support people in their area. Now, that doesn't mean creating jobs. You can't do that. That's not the way it works. But it does mean you can stop deeply unfair competition. Now, competition of ideas, fine. I'm sorry, sometimes you're going to lose, and when that happens, good luck, and and we'll see change. But
it's also efficient allocation of capital, which helps drive down cost, all the usual things.
When you're seeing, however, massive and distorting subsidies, whether that's in terms of labour regulations or in terms of actual financial subsidies, that's different.
So just to loop back round then, we've talked a bit about Nigel Farage. Obviously, the big question that all of the leadership contenders are getting asked is what are we going to do about reform? Interestingly, you've just said you're a Kent MP, slightly different to my part of the woods, where the Lib Dems have no chance whatsoever, certainly in the near term. What is Tom's strategy as leader of the Conservative Party to deal with reform, taking into account as well that we also have the Lib Dem question to answer as well?
Yeah, I mean, look, and the Lib Dems don't like me saying this, but I'm afraid it's true. But there's an awful lot of overlap between Lib Dem and Reform. And the truth is, you've got a lot of people who are angry at us, perfectly understandably, for the psychodrama of the last 5 years, for the failures of leadership and the factionalism, right? I mean, you and I would share, I think, quite a lot of that criticism.
Yep.
And some people expressed it in your neck of the woods mostly by voting Reform, in my neck of the woods mostly by voting Lib Dem or Green. But actually, when you poll people on what they care about, yes, they all care about migration and the fact that it's harder to get to see a GP or to get to a place in a hospital. They all care about house prices, meaning that kids can't live near them or their grandchildren don't have a start in life. Everybody cares about very similar things. I wouldn't say exactly the same things, but very similar things. And so fundamentally, actually, the question is the same, whether you're trying to approach Reform or Lib Dems. And the key is you've got to reform the Conservative Party, because the Conservative Party isn't currently delivering a conservative agenda. We're not currently taking on that sort of conservative revolutionary mission that we last took on in the 1980s. Now,
well, the biggest challenge you're going to have if you become leader is that trying to build that credibility and that delivery and that trust back with the public in opposition, where you're not actually responsible for delivering anything because you're not in government. So how do you go about doing that?
You say that, Ben, but we are in government. You're in government, right? And demonstrating conservative leadership isn't just about demonstrating it in Westminster. In fact, one of the problems of our party, in fact, of every party, over the last few decades is the over-centralisation on Westminster, that massive over-focus on Westminster, as though, you haven't done anything, or council leaders haven't done anything, or, or even the other parliaments haven't done anything. The truth is, what's done in the Scottish Parliament or the Welsh Senate fundamentally matters. They are making decisions that are changing lives. And we need to be much clearer that when Conservatives oppose, for example, the massive over-centralisation of education in Wales by the Labour Party, what they're doing is they're championing the rights of families to choose. They're championing the rights of children to learn. Just as importantly, just as fundamentally, as if they were doing that in England or anywhere else. And we should be just as proud of them for doing it, and we should be highlighting it. And your other, I don't know why he keeps getting forgotten, but Jason, who's in Croydon, who keeps being forgotten as the other mayor, Conservative mayor, is taking on Labour and their failures in London under Sadiq Khan, just as importantly as you are taking on huge differences and challenges in the North East. So, our record, and the record that I'll be standing on in 4 years' time, is a record of transformation, first of all, of the Conservative Party, second, of the policies that we need to make sure that we're ready on day one to transform Britain for the better. But third, it's going to be on the record of transformation that you've achieved, because actually I have long believed that the partnership that we need to build is not just uniting the Conservative Party in Westminster, but uniting the Conservative values and views across the whole of the United Kingdom. And that's why serving people in Teesside or Kent or London or wherever it is, or Scotland or Wales, and then offering that leadership is the only way you're going to achieve the action that makes a difference.
I think you're absolutely right, Tom. It's been fascinating talking to you. Really appreciate your time. Good luck with the leadership election, and hopefully we'll be having you back on soon.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank you for listening to the Blueprint podcast, brought to you by Conservative Home with me, Ben Houchin. Remember, you can like and subscribe on all of our social media channels, and you can catch a new episode every single Wednesday wherever you get your usual podcasts from.